punishable by up to 15 years in jail for Muslims to perform everyday religious practices like praying, giving to charity or fasting, because that would be defined as banned Sharia practices. Also on Thursday, congressional hearings will start looking at the so-called radicalization of Muslims in the US. So on today's show we ask, has the American Muslim community become the target of a political witch hunt in the post-9/11 era? Remember, you can join our conversation by sending an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, joining us from California is the renowned Muslim intellectual Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. After the 9/11 attacks in the US, Sheikh Hamza emerged as a respected Islamic scholar advising both the White House and the Arab League. In recent years, he's focused his teachings on countering the widening gap between the Muslim world and the West. He's also the founder and chairman of the Zaytuna Institute based in California. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, good to have you on the show again.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Well, first of all, I want to refer to those sound bites from the opening of the show. You heard a number of people, obviously some clear prejudices there, and I wonder, what is it that allows people in the US to talk about Islam in this way, and yet if it had been any other religion they'd been talking about, there would have been quite an outcry?
Well, I think it's a good point. I think Bill Maher on a regular basis says things that anybody else, had they said them about any other group, say, for instance, Jews or blacks, or other minorities, or even religious groups, they would have lost their job by now. But I think it shows you the extent of the acceptable nature of just being anti-Arab, being anti-Muslim. So, unfortunately, it's deeply disturbing for those of us who have families who, for instance, many people's wives wear traditional clothing when they go out, or at least a head covering with Western style clothing. But increasingly, we're seeing this antagonism in the United States. And I think it's a result of many, now since 9/11, it's been just unrelenting attacks on talk radio, an incredible number of books that have come out against Islam. One of the things, and I think Pat Robertson displayed that in his statement just now, that this idea that Islam somehow is an ideology, that it's a political system as opposed to being a world religion. And I think 1,400 years of Islamic history completely denies that ridiculous assumption.
Let me get an email to you, if I may, that came in from South Africa, from Cape Town. And Cameron Peter wrote in saying, have Muslims replaced the Cold War communist bogeyman in the American psyche?
It's a good point. I think there was a book written, John Stockwell, a former CIA operative, wrote a book called In Search of Enemies. And one of the things that we've noted in the United States is, despite the declining purchasing power of the dollar, despite the spiraling debt, the one sacred cow of the American deficit or budget is military spending. And military spending is actually at Cold War numbers, and if you adjust it for inflation, it's quite stunning what's happened, and that's all been justified by the war on terror. More people died in the United States last year from dog bites than died from terrorist attacks. Less than 3 people. Many of these attacks, in fact, according to the FBI, are actually done by fundamentalist Christians against abortion doctors and things like that. So I think there's just an immense overblown aspect to this whole thing that to me is deeply troubling, because I think things get very distorted. They call it the media magnifying glass that can really distort a threat or distort some statistical insignificance out there into something very significant.
Now, of course, we've got 15 states here in the US targeting Sharia law. What do you see as the consequences of that?
Well, I think, first of all, there's an immense amount of misunderstanding about what Sharia is. There are only 2 sections in any traditional text on sacred law that deal with governance, and that only involves government agencies. They're called Ahkam al-Sultaniya. Sharia is mostly about purification, about prayer, about fasting, about paying your zakat, a poor tax, to help the poor and disenfranchised. That is the bulk of the Sharia. The idea that you have to enact laws in the United States to prevent Sharia from being established or enacted is absurd, because the Constitution of the United States already states that that is the basis of the law of the land. So anything that is from Sharia that would be considered unconstitutional is ipso facto unacceptable in the United States. And I think to me, one of the interesting things about this is that one area that is applicable in the United States is Islamic commercial law that prohibits a lot of the financial instruments that are out there causing devastating effects on Americans. And I think it's very interesting that certainly the bankers would not want that aspect of Islam to become widespread knowledge amongst American people, the prohibition of exploitative financial instruments. And the fact that a lot of usury laws that still exist in the United States are completely ignored. They go into states like the Dakotas where they don't have usury laws, and so these credit card companies can completely exploit people, when I think in the 19th century Americans would have been up in arms about a lot of what's going on now.
We had another email. I'm going to put this to you, if I may. This came in from Chicago in the USA, where Oshua Ryan wrote in saying, I think the US values the contributions of Muslim communities and respects them, but does not condone or nor accept the practices of Sharia law that goes against the legal and democratic principles of a modern, civilized societies of the 21st century. Now, I'm wondering, if you've had any contact with the United States government. I know you advise the government regularly on these kind of issues, on this issue of targeting the Sharia law, and how, if you have, you've advised them.
Well, I haven't actually, but I would say, first of all, again, the Sharia is not a threat to the United States Constitution or the United States law. Many of the things in Islamic law are rational. They're completely compatible with Western ideas. I think what people focus on are certain penal codes, that much of which in the Islamic law is not agreed upon, but there are certain aspects of the Sharia. But even if you examine the Sharia, you'll find that it's actually profoundly nuanced. I think people see things like Nigeria, a woman being threatened of being stoned because of adultery or something like that. And these are, I think, the unfortunate trials and tribulations of having certain pre-modern conceptions that were quite normative in the pre-modern world that Muslims still adhere to in the modern world. And so places like Iran, where they do implement certain punishments that I think in the spirit of the Sharia would not be implemented in this day and age. You can't cut off the hands of people in consumer societies that we live in today. So there are many aspects of the Sharia, I think, that are just completely distorted. And another aspect that I think is really important is the fact that in the United States, by and large, you have a population of civil people. In fact, I think the demonstration that happened in Yorba Linda is an anomaly. I think the majority of Americans are decent people that acknowledge multiculturalism. America has always been a multicultural society. We have Amish people that don't use technology in the United States. There's no iPhones or iPads in Amish land. And so America has always allowed for people to explore alternative lifestyles, as long as you do not go against the laws of the land. And that is Sharia. If you live in America, you have to follow American law. That is Sharia.
I'm going to bring in a caller, actually, who's been waiting on the line from Bangladesh. Rashid, thank you for being with us. What would you like to ask?